And I think we're still in a place where we're feeling the reverberations of the Treasure Cruise ban. Like you mentioned, Dragons of Tarkir probably doesn't offer very much for the format. Probably a couple cards here and there that might show up, but it's not going to make huge waves. There's no Treasure Cruise, there's no Tasigur really hanging out. So what's happening is the format is still adapting to Treasure Cruise being banned a couple months ago. And what's happening as a result of that are people are going back to some older, some more mid-range decks, some more control decks, some attrition-based strategies that were really pushed out of the format when Treasure Cruise was prevalent, but now those decks have a chance to shine.
Yeah, and that's kind of the change that's taken place with the Treasure Cruise out of the format. Everyone kind of expected everything to kind of revert back to how things were with Wastelands and all that stuff, and we've seen some minor changes here and there, but the big sticking point is the Treasure Cruise is gone, but Dig Through Time is really starting to shine.
Now, Ross Miriam was mentioning while we were talking earlier this morning that he was anticipating that Elves would be a good metagame choice once again. He was always comfortable playing the attrition matchups. It's just that Combo and the Treasure Cruise matchups were not very good. And he said that Dig Through Time is a close enough approximation to Treasure Cruise for enough decks that there's still a lot of young Pyromancers hanging around and a lot of splash damage as a result. So it seems like the format is somewhere in between, yes, we're Treasure Cruise, yes, we're full throttle on that card, and the format pre-Constant here, because Dig Through Time and some of the other card drawers can do a reasonable interpretation of Treasure Cruise.
All right, well, we'll be diving into Legacy in just a sec. Now, when you think of Legacy, I think you have to think about Brainstorm, you have to think about Ponder, and what kind of decks really facilitate those cards the best. And it seems over the course of at least the past couple of months in our Legacy metagame, it has been Sultai Delver. Now, of course, there are many Delver strategies. There's Temur, there's Jeskai, and before Treasure Cruise got banned, there was Blue-Red. But Sultai Delver looks to be kind of standing on top of things right now. I think at Jim Davis's when we were in Indianapolis, and a lot of players are gravitating towards this strategy, not only back then, but right now for this weekend. Sultai Delver, with the use of course, Delver of Secrets, Tarmogoyf, and Tasigur, looks to maybe be the best Delver deck right now.
And this was pretty much the top of the list in terms of decks that got pushed out of the format when Treasure Cruise was prevalent. Starless Sultai being another example of this. Cards like Treasure Cruise are really nice and really flexible, but when the format's about just drawing a bunch of cards, raw card count matters a lot, mana efficiency is the order of the day, cards like Abrupt Decay, Tasigur, Tarmogoyf, they aren't necessarily the most efficient things to be doing. Now, with the metagame in a slightly slower, slightly more powerful place, cards like Abrupt Decay, Tarmogoyf, they're very well positioned, and as you mentioned, of the Delver decks in the room, and there's all sorts of them, I expect Sultai Delver to be the most represented one.
I think so too. You know, Abrupt Decay was kind of bad during the Treasure Cruise metagame, back to being the great card that it is. The discard spells, Thoughtseize, that card is obviously great. A lot of nice sideboard options, but the card that has impressed me the most is actually the newest one in Tasigur, because it really is just a 1-mana 4/5 in Legacy, and the text and the ability doesn't come up a ton, but when it does, that means you're probably doing pretty well for yourself.
Definitely. As opposed to Modern and Standard, where this card gets activated a bunch, not really the case in Legacy. The format's so fast that it's rare to get to a spot where you have 4 mana, you're using this over and over again, and you're not just burying your opponent with it. That said, a 1-mana 4/5 is very, very powerful in this format outside of bolt range and something that can block Tarmogoyf very effectively.
Yeah, we can't forget, it can't be killed by Abrupt Decay either.
Yeah.
So it checks off a lot of very important boxes, especially in the mirror match as well. So I expect to see a lot of this deck this particular weekend. Not to say that Temur Delver, Jeskai Delver can't show up, or even Blue-Red Delver, but this looks to be the Delver choice for most people.
And Tasigur is an especially important addition to a format like Legacy, because in Standard and Modern, you run into the Legacy clause, the Legend clause of this card quite a bit. But in a format where you can shuffle away cards with Brainstorm, it gives you more of an incentive to play 2 or even 3 copies of this card and not feel the legendary tax on as much as you would in other formats.
Now, if you think of another Ponder, Brainstorm deck, it's pretty easy to gravitate towards a deck that has done very well, not only in the Open Series, but mostly in Invitationals. I think of Jean Cerrone, I think of Stoneplate decks. They can't be the Esper variety, it can't be Jeskai variety, excuse me. There's a lot of different ways you can go. Blue-White if you want to play it pretty fair and pretty safe. We've seen a lot of players over the course of the Invitationals here have a lot of success with just cast Stoneforge Mystic, get a Batterskull. You better have an answer.
And just like the Sultai Delver deck, Stoneforge Mystic was another card that was pushed out of the format by Treasure Cruise. When the blue-red decks were fueled with a bunch of bolts and fort bolts and drawing a bunch of cards, Stoneforge Mystic would show up, get killed, and you would not get time to deploy your Batterskull. Now the format's a little bit slower, and cards like Stoneforge Mystic I think are going to be a bigger player than they were a couple months ago.
And with the slowdown of the format means that some Planeswalkers can play an important role too. Liliana is one, but the big one, and it's kind of the one that kind of got shifted out with Treasure Cruise, is Jace the Mind Sculptor. This card you have to imagine is back in a big way.
Well, I mean, it's hard to imagine that this card was ever really pushed out of Legacy, but it just goes to show you how powerful the format is, that something like Jace the Mind Sculptor can get pushed out. But again, another kind of expensive, kind of slow, very powerful Magic card. all of these, or nearly all of them, were significantly pushed out of the format when Treasure Cruise was around. Now they should be back in a big way.
Now, my question, of course, is, again, Dragonstark here, we're not sure what kind of effect that set's going to have on things, but a lot of people are trying to work Narset into this deck or some sort of Stoneblade deck. The plus ability, where you can set up a Brainstorm and Ponder to make sure you get a card, a lot of loyalty there, and we can't forget about Rebound. Everyone's talking about Rebound in Standard with, I Rebound at Dig Through Time, Rebound and Hostilities, and then they can't play creatures next turn. You can Rebound Brainstorms, you can Rebound Ponders. There's a lot more powerful things to be rebounding in Legacy than Standard.
It's true. The floor for 4-mana spells in Legacy is just so high.
It really is.
That even a card like Narset, which is definitely powerful, and I anticipate we're going to be seeing in the standard portion of this tournament, just might not be able to show up. But as you mentioned, it's got a lot of loyalty, and Rebound's very attractive in a deck that plays with a bunch of cantrips. Something that Narset can't do that Jace can is protect you and the board the tournament comes into play.
Yeah.
Narset doesn't have anything like an unsummon effect to stabilize the board while you're trying to set up your Planeswalker. But on a stable board, this card's very powerful, but it remains to be seen. Legacy is just such a powerful format that 4-mana spells, they have to be really, really good. You think it's basically Jace the Mind Sculptor, Bloodbraid Elf, which is kind of its own thing because it's an attrition-based strategy that gets the 4-mana a little bit more reliably. But once you get past that, there's just not a lot of room for those kind of cards to show up in Legacy.
Yeah, we'll see if this card does show up in Stoneblade decks this weekend, a deck we certainly expect to be here this weekend. We also expect a little bit of combo here. We've seen Storm doing pretty well, but we've also seen Sneak and Show start to do a little bit better here. It's a very obvious deck. You've got Show and Tell, you've got Sneak Attack, Dig Through Time is kind of thrown in there now as kind of the new addition. Emrakul, Gristlebrand, some Ponders, some Brainstorms to tie the room together. It's not flashy anymore at this point. We've been seeing it for a couple of years, but it still gets the job done.
It's powerful, it's consistent, and I expect it to be the most popular combo deck in the room. I see no reason for it not to be.
Yeah, there's really not a lot to say. We saw its dominance on the Open Series a couple of years ago. I think of William Jensen, I think of Jerry Thompson, Brad Nelson when he won his Invitational in Indianapolis in the back half of 2013. It's a good deck.
Yep.
And Dig Through Time is a nice addition. It's not a 4 of edition. It's like 1 or 2 of to kind of maybe make things a little more consistent because you do fill your graveyard up with those fetch lands and those Ponders and those Brainstorms and those Preordains, and we can't forget about Cataxian Probe as well. But it's just a straightforward, good combo deck that a lot of really good players like to gravitate towards.
Yeah, and it's almost something that I feel like the deck isn't even that matchup sensitive because even in the counterspell matchups, you have your own counterspells you can push back. You can set up very good hands with your cantrip. So, like you said, it's just powerful. It's consistent. We've seen it now for a couple of years, and I see no reason for it to diminish at this tournament.
Matchup sensitivity is what Lands is all about. So I'm glad you brought that up because that is a deck that is very matchup sensitive. It either has an A+ matchup or an F- matchup, it seems. There's really no in between. If he's playing against a fair deck like Delver or Stoneblade, life is pretty good. If it's playing against a deck like Sneak and Show or Storm, life is pretty bad. I think of David Long, a player who's had a lot of Open Series success, has top-8'd our Legacy Open. We were in Philadelphia. He actually made the top 4 of that tournament before being dispatched. He also has some top 8s in some Legacy Premier IQs as well in the Open Series circuit, kind of flying under the radar a little bit, but he has been very, very consistent with lands. And again, this is a deck that it has some A+ or some F-. In tournaments like this, where there is a decent amount of combo, but the players really gravitate towards Brainstorm and Ponders and fair decks, might have a lot of A+ this weekend.
Well, as formats expand, the sandbox gets bigger. The things that you're able to do gets bigger. And as a result of this, you're going to have more and more matchups where I'm off doing this thing, and you're off doing that thing, and we don't really collide very much, as opposed to Standard, where it's a lot of creatures and removal spells, and our decks will interact on some baseline level. No deck in Legacy, in my opinion, highlights this better than Lands. When Lands is locking out your mana, when it's preventing creatures from attacking with things like Maze of Ith and Tabernacle of Pendrell Vale, the deck is very hard to interact with and very powerful. When it's playing against spell-based combo decks, where Lands is kind of focused on locking up the board and not really playing against your hand very much, it has very little game. And most Land sideboards you see, as a result of this, play with a lot of anti-combo measures to try to make up the matchup a little bit post-board. That said, if you're anticipating a lot of creature decks, this is a very powerful choice. Lands has an exceptional matchup against most creature-based strategies.
Last but certainly not least, there are a lot of Legacy decks, of course. We could talk about a ton of them, but it would be poor form if we didn't mention Tom Ross, 2-time Invitational champion last year, also top-8 at Grand Prix New Jersey before being dispatched by Brian Braun-Duin in the finals. Tom, as we all know, likes to play Infect. Wouldn't surprise me if he's playing it yet again this weekend. This is a deck where we see him. We sometimes see Brad Nelson, we see Todd Anderson, maybe some other players start to gravitate towards this strategy. From what I have heard on the floor, a lot of players are interested in playing this deck this weekend.
It's very powerful. Legacy has a couple decks that kind of split the difference between being beatdown decks and combo decks. Burns one of them, for example. In fact, absolutely one of them as well. has had some really good results on the Open Series in the last 15 months or so. Tom Ross being at the top of the list, but other players with a lot of success. And especially with Sultai kind of being maybe the deck of the room, it does not interact very well against Inkmoth Nexus. Yes, the deck has a couple copies of Wasteland, but its marquee removal spell, Abrupt Decay, can't touch lands. And as a result of that, Inkmoth Nexus is a very problematic card for a lot of the builds of Sultai Delver. And as a result of that, if you're expecting a lot of Abrupt Decays, this can be a very good deck.
We have seen Tom clean up on Sultai Delver decks in the past quite a bit because of most of that interaction you talk about. Abrupt Decay not being able to kill Inkmoth Nexus. And you might think, okay, that's just one layer to the matchup, but that's a huge layer because the decks have Brainstorms and Ponders and all this stuff. So, you know, the Infect deck can find Inkmoth Nexus very consistently, and the Sultai Delver deck, of course, can find Abrupt Decay very consistently, and those don't line up appropriately, which puts things in favor of Infect.
Yeah, I when I first just read the deck list for those two decks, I just assumed, well, yeah, it's Abrupt Decay. This deck is trying to protect a small threat with counter spells. Abrupt Decay should swing the matchup. Inkmoth Nexus is a huge problem.
Yep.
Binds the Basswood is a big problem for that kind of sequence. And just the mana exchanges, you know, Infect operates on such an efficient mana curve that spending 2 mana to remove their 1 mana play, it's better than dying, but it's not the type of exchange that's actually pulling you ahead in the game.
Oh. That is Legacy, and that is where things will start this weekend. We'll have 4 rounds of that to begin today, 4 rounds of that to begin tomorrow, but Standard is the high